This is American Government for Friday, August 27th. And again, of course, you know we're not meeting because of the memorial service for Dr. Barker. Today I'm going to cover the material that I sent in the notes last night, and you'll see this essentially consists of the history leading up to the Revolution and to the Declaration of Independence, and then looking at the structure, the outline of the Declaration of Independence. And I gave you the outline form, and if you practice that, that's good. But one way or the other, I'm going to fill it in and cover that material today. And then we'll discuss some interesting preliminary questions about the nature of the language and authority. That is to say, the Declaration says certain things about human beings and government and the rightfulness of the cause of the American Revolution. What makes its statements true? What's its basis of authority? And you're going to see this points to what we'll be discussing next week on Monday and Wednesday, and that is the core teachings about government. I'm going to group those core teachings into three basic groups. There is a teaching in the Declaration about nature, and I mean nature in terms of the nature of existence and the natural world. There's a second group of profound teachings in the Declaration about human nature. And then there's a third set of core principled teachings, theoretical teachings, and that's about the nature, purpose, and character of government. So I wanted to just take a few minutes to recapitulate what I talked about on Wednesday, and the notion of the regime or the constitution, small c, the political system of a nation, and its four primary elements: shared ideas about justice and human nature, a set of institutions that is based upon and embodies those principles, policies, laws, and actions of the governing institutions that actually then set the nation on its course through time and space, and then finally a kind of citizen culture or way of life that flows from the premises. And just a couple of things you should note, that these four parts of a political system, of a regime or a constitution or a polity, I'll probably hover in using the terms that I discussed between regime and constitution. Not only did I go over them because that explains how my course is laid out and what we examine in this course, starting with, of course, the foundational ideas of America as contained in the document, the Declaration of Independence. Remember, all nations have a political system. All political entities, nations that do politics have a political system, a constitution, a regime, even if it's unwritten, like in the British Constitution. Remember that the United States was the first nation, excepting perhaps ancient Israel. Some people consider the Old Testament, the Torah, to be the constitution of the ancient nation of Israel, which is an interesting way to look at it. But the United States was the first true country or nation, political system, to actually try to put its regime in a document. And I'll talk a little bit about that today and throughout the course as to why the writtenness of our Constitution, which, by the way, almost all other modern governments have imitated this. The 200 or so nations in the United Nations now almost all have written constitutions. Not all, but most of them do, in imitation of our Constitution. So not only did I want to go over that to explain what we're doing in the course and what we'll be covering, first the Declaration, and then we'll move out to the governing institutions, the first failed Constitution of the United States in the Articles of Confederation, and then, of course, we'll look at the drafting and the formation and the nature of the U.S. Constitution. And then after the first midterm, by the way, if you look on the schedule, both the syllabus and the daily schedule, then we're actually going to turn to an intense examination of the Constitution in front of us. South Carolina statute actually requires that college students be instructed in the Constitution and the Declaration, and I've shaped my class around those requirements. And then if you look at the rest of the syllabus, then we'll be looking at the other governing institutions, the actual institutions that the Constitution shapes and that we are governed by. And we'll also be raising some questions about the American way of life and issues in it, and including the great controversies that have seized our nation. So that's why I wanted to kind of lay out my approach, because it really does explain what we're doing in this course, and I also think, of course, it helps one to understand politics. And just to walk you through, I mean, so what are the core ideas, the foundational ideas of America, which are contained in a document? As you're going to see, I'm going to argue the core or foundational idea of American political life is the notion of natural rights, that human beings are born with rights. And as you will discover, the doctrine of rights actually says two subsidiary teachings about human beings, that they are both equal. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are free, that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights. So in next week, when we talk about the core teachings, I'll explain what the Declaration means by nature and nature's God. We'll talk a little bit about that today. But then we'll talk about rights and what it means to say. So do Americans really share this idea that human beings have rights? Is that the foundational idea? And I would say yes. What's proof of that, by the way? Almost all political controversies, whether it's slavery, whether it's abortion, whether it's civil rights, whether it's transgender issues, they all are debates about the meaning of rights. Who has rights? What kind of rights do people have? And how should people be made? What does it mean to say people are equal? And what does it mean to say people are free? Americans may have different notions of equality and freedom and rights, but all American debates, political debates and struggles, are about giving meaning to and understanding the concept of rights. As an example of that, look at abortion. The pro-choice people and the pro-life people, they have profoundly different views of the nature of this issue. But what do they both agree on? They both agree that it is an issue of rights. So almost all political issues always come back to an attempt to define and explain and apply what the concept of rights is in our politics. And as we'll see, the first couple of years of our nation's, couple of decades of our nation's existence after the Declaration of Independence and after the war for independence was won successfully, and we became an independent country, was debate about what kind of institutions we should be governed by. And we'll explain the Articles of Confederation and the meaning of that set of institutions, why it failed, and why the framers then, in the Constitutional Convention or the Federal Convention of 1787, drafted the Constitution, and what those institutions mean. Throughout the course, we'll be looking at articles by political scientists, by speeches by great politicians or not-so-great politicians, laws and other policies to examine how American political life has tried to give shape to these ideas, living under our institutions. Now, this is not a public policy course, and I generally don't discuss in this course, in my introductory American government course, I don't discuss public policy, although we may refer to them. And as for the larger cultural issues of American life, you'll see that to some degree, the actual lives that we lead of Americans actually both vibrates with the Declaration and follows from it, shaped by the institutions we live under and the policies and actions that those institutions take. And even though there are profoundly different ways of American life, there really is an American way of life in this kind of fourth level of the regime. And you should note, by the way, that probably you might be surprised that we'll be discussing like ideas, which you would expect to find in a philosophy class, or the culture or way of life of Americans, which you might expect to find in a sociology class. Again, my notion of politics, as I said, was essentially from Aristotle, Aristotelian, that politics is the comprehensive way of life of a nation, including those four elements: ideas, institutions, laws and policies, and ways of life. So, let's begin with the first layer of our regime, its core ideas. Now, as I said, my method in exploring the Declaration of Independence is to start from the outside, from the circumstances that lead up to it, and explain why the Declaration is written and how it was written, that kind of stuff. And some of these dates, by the way, as I mentioned on Monday and Wednesday, this is not a history class, but there are some important aspects of history that are critical to your understanding our politics. And there are two sets of dates that I will test you on and that you have to be responsible for on the notes. If you'll see, those dates that are asterisked are the ones that you have to learn. And the first question on the first midterm is going to be a series of dates that I'll give and you'll have to explain. So I'll talk about those today. Those are the ones that explain the Revolution and lead up to the Declaration. And also, as you'll see, there will be a second set of dates when we discuss the Constitutional Convention and the formation of the Constitution. So, and then we'll look at the structure and then some issues of language. Again, moving from the outside to the document itself, to the structure of the document, and Monday and Wednesday of this coming week we'll turn to its internal teachings. We're sort of going from the outside to the inside of the document. So In 1608 to 1609, the Jamestown colony was founded in Virginia, but it eventually failed, although you can still visit Jamestown. And because who was king in England at that time? James the First. Now, this has been controversial, and some of you may have heard, or may have studied the 1619 project in high school, and as you'll see, this date has become visible and important because in 1619, the first set of African slaves or indentured servants, historians dispute as to what the nature of the 8 to 10 or so individuals who were brought on shore, but you could say, perhaps accurately, that is the beginning of slavery in America. Now we'll see Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was the author and editor of the 1619 project, makes a very controversial claim that that's the true founding of the country. Again, we'll be exploring that. We'll be reading aspects of the 1619 project and also looking at different commentaries and critics of that project. But at any rate, you could say that the true beginning of the colonies, since the Jamestown colony was only moderately successful and actually collapsed eventually, it was in 1620 when the Pilgrims and the Mayflower came over and founded the Plymouth colony. Now, as I mentioned in class, this is critical not only because actually the New England colonies became the true basis of American life, but also because I think this partially explains what's important looking at 1620 and the Mayflower Compact, was that you could say the first genuine American colony started out by trying to put its political life and purpose in a document. So this American obsession with putting our political life down on documents, I think, goes back to the very beginning. And you can look at the compact, I quote a good portion of it here, and you can see the purpose of this colony is to be a Christian colony, and yet acknowledges the divine sovereignty of King James. And so you could say, by the way, at this point, this first American experiment, which is not a nation, we're not a country yet, we're still part of Great Britain, we're colonies, is what are its core ideas? The divine right of kings, which is a form of human inequality. And so in some ways, the fact that they were Christians, they were Protestants, Puritans, that has a profound effect on the unfolding of American life since that time. But at least there's the foundational document of American life, the Mayflower Compact. Now, go ahead about a century or so, the colonies began to develop. There are different kinds of colonies, commercial, religious, royal colonies. And it's true, slavery becomes embedded in the economic and political life of the South, primarily through plantation slavery. Now, so to go ahead, and what actually the history that leads up to the Revolution and starts the process of independence, you don't have to remember these dates, but you should just be the next date you do have to think about is the Stamp Act, and you'll see why in a minute when I talk about that. In reality, the beginning towards independence, the movement towards independence begins in the 1750s. In 1754, in particular, the French and Indian War, where the French colonists in Canada and throughout the middle part of the country, together with certain Native American tribes, began to wage war on the British colonists. And the Crown and Parliament authorized the importation of thousands of British soldiers, and in fact, George Washington, who was born in Virginia, generally the officers of the army, of the British Army at this point, were British officers, and then the soldiers and subordinate officers were Americans. And that's how George Washington got his first combat experience in the French and Indian War. Not successful, by the way. Although the British did win, that is to say the British colonists and Britain did win this French and Indian War, and this is what leads then to the beginning of the conflict and the split. So, how do you pay for all those British troops and everything? Well, in 1765, Parliament, signed by the King, that passed the Stamp Act, which put a tax on all printed goods, magazines, newspapers, everything. And if you had anything printed, you have to buy a stamp that shows that you paid the tax. And that starts the disagreement, because the colonists considered that the imposition of taxes on them through Parliament, when they weren't represented in Parliament, led to the first great conflict. So the colonists began to resent this taxation, and that was one of the slogans of the Revolution: no taxation without representation. That has an effect on the final Constitution, as you'll see too. Now, so there was resistance to the tax, and then Parliament and the King began to follow up with a series of punitive other acts. The Quartering Act, which forced American households and private establishments to quarter, which is to house British troops to sent in to quell down the resistance. The Declaratory Act of 1766, which declared the colonies in open rebellion. And in 1773, you may have heard of the Boston Tea Party, where a bunch of colonists dressed as Native Americans and destroyed the shipment of tea. In 1774, the Intolerable Acts, a series of punitive taxes and other actions placed on the colonists. And that led to 1774, which is the next important date here. In 1774, the colonies formed the First Continental Congress on September 5th. Why is this important? Because for the first time, the colonists began to unite politically in a common institution of continental importance. Now, you're going to see there's a First Continental Congress and a Second Continental Congress, with an important series of battles in between the two Congresses. And here's how to distinguish them. The purpose of the First Continental Congress was not independence. The colonists still considered themselves loyal Brits, and so the First Continental Congress its purpose was to kind of coordinate their complaints and kind of present a common face to the Parliament and to the Crown. And it's interesting, by the way, if we had reconciled, what would reconciliation like? Perhaps, for instance, they might have restructured the Parliament so that American colonists were now sent as members to the Parliament. So at this point in time, this could have worked out differently. We could have still been parts of the British Empire or the British Commonwealth up until this century. But of course, what happened was that the petitions for reconciliation. So the purpose of the First Continental Congress was really to reconcile with the Crown and the Parliament. But again, that's not how the Crown reacted. It reacted with more force, and the Parliament with more punitive legislation. And in fact, on 1775, this is critical, the Revolutionary War begins with the Battle of Lexington and Concord on April 19th. You've heard of the Ride of Paul Revere. And in some ways, so the fighting, the Revolutionary War began before the movement towards independence even began. And so you'd have to say that on May 1775, about a month after Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress was formed, and its spirit was different. Because fighting had broken out, the sense that perhaps our two nations lay on different paths, or that we should become a separate nation, was the spirit of the Second Continental Congress. And so we move now to 1776. On January 10th of 1776, the critical event was a publishing event, and that was the publishing of the author Thomas Paine's Common Sense. It was a pamphlet. And there are several great bestsellers in American life, books and publications that have been instant and remarkable and enduring bestsellers. You may be interested to know that the Bible, it turns out, is the best-selling book in American history. Second behind that was Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1853, which was a remarkably best-selling book, sent hundreds of thousands of copies. Benjamin Franklin's autobiography was also one of the major bestsellers. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, a religious Christian text, was also a bestseller. But it turns out that Paine's Common Sense was a great bestseller. Within a couple of months, they printed 300,000 copies that were distributed throughout the colonies. And if you look at the text of Common Sense, you can begin to see the core ideas of the Declaration of Independence beginning to take shape. That is to say, a new American identity, not based on obedience to the Crown or the divine right of kings or membership in the Christian British nation, but rather the idea of rights beginning to coagulate. And so it was probably the publication of Common Sense that began to really crystallize a common way of American thought and a movement towards our status as an independent country founded on a different set of ideas. And on June 7th, this is a critical date. This is the Resolution on Independence from Richard Henry Lee from Virginia. The Second Continental Congress had resolved that there would be no independence unless one of the colonial capitals moved independence outside of Congress. And Richard Henry Lee, the great whatever father of Robert E. Lee, and etc. Lees were a major leading family in Virginia, brought back from Williamsburg, which was the capital of the colony of Virginia before it was moved to Richmond. And if you've ever visited Colonial Williamsburg, it's kind of interesting. So he brought back the Resolution of Independence, and it's worth looking at the text because you can see how this frames the eventual Declaration of Independence. Resolved, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. You're going to see that survives in the first paragraph and the last paragraph of the Declaration. The second element in Lee's resolution on June 7th was that it is expedient forthwith that the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances, which became one of the motives for the publication of the Declaration, to announce to the world that we were a separate country and to begin to get foreign assistance, which of course did enable us to win the Revolutionary War with France. And then third, that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. So the third element of the Resolution for Independence was to form a new government. And that's eventually what becomes the Articles of Confederation. We'll talk more about that next week and the week after. So what happened was the Congress created a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence, including Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and John Adams, who was one of the primary movers towards independence in the Second Continental Congress. So the five-person committee met and delegated to Thomas Jefferson, the young delegate from Virginia. And if you've seen the great movie 1776, which we're watching in my Hamilton class, that actually contains a good deal of real drama about it. Jefferson wrote a rough draft of the Declaration, which we'll look at in a minute because of some interesting issues of language. And then on July 2nd, the committee adopted Jefferson's draft, and then resubmitted it to Congress. And on July 2nd, Congress actually approved Lee's Resolution of Independence. So you could say the United States of America begins to come into existence. Now, why don't we celebrate July 2nd rather than July 4th? Because for 2 more days then, the Second Continental Congress debated Jefferson and the committee's draft of the Declaration of Independence, and made, I think, several hundred changes in wording and everything, although Jefferson's draft essentially survives. And then on the early morning, around 2 to 3 in the morning, most historians believe, because the Second Continental Congress met at night, at around 2 to 3 in the morning on July 4th, they adopted the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, John Hancock, the president of the Second Continental Congress, whose name appears in big letters in the signed, embossed version, which was actually drafted and signed on August 8th, but the Declaration itself was adopted early July 4th, around 8 to 9 in the morning on the steps of Independence Hall, which was the state capital of Pennsylvania at that time. He read the Declaration to a set of Americans. It was quickly sent to George Washington, who read it to the troops, and it did rally the troops and sent throughout the colonies. So that's why we formally celebrate independence on July 4th. That was the day the Declaration of Independence was adopted. So a couple of other dates that bring us up to the period of the founding is in 1777, a committee was formed about a year later after the Declaration, and chaired by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who then drafted the Articles. Those were sent out to the states, and it was not until March of 1781 that the Articles of Confederation were finally ratified and became our official form of government. So 1781 is important because that's the ratification of the Articles of Confederation by the state capitals. And then on October 19th, that's the Battle of Yorktown, where about 5,000 Americans and 7,000 French in ships in the bay cornered the Lord Cornwallis's troops, and Lord Cornwallis surrendered British troops to George Washington. And so October 19th, 1781 is the formal end of the Revolutionary War. The last major date in this initial period is 1783, the Treaty of Paris, where American negotiators negotiated with King George, and so that treaty formally granted us our independence. So that is the series of dates for the founding that kind of frame the drafting of the Declaration of Independence and its meaning in American life, at least initially. And you'll see, by the way, there are reasons why we have to remember the Treaty of Paris, because of certain provisions in this Treaty of Paris, which the British did not fulfill, and led to the conflicts and the decline of American power during the next 11 years, which is one of the reasons that we moved towards the Constitutional Convention. So there are the major dates of the founding. You should memorize the ones that are asterisked. So now let's actually turn to the Declaration of its Independence itself. And here's the outline that I passed out. Some of you might have filled out, but here it is completed. The Declaration is an argument, not like married people argue, like you did the dishes, no I don't, and you never pick up your underwear, etc. An argument, going back to Greek logic, is a structured presentation of thought, a defense of a certain position. It begins with assumptions, has different moments of structured argument, and comes to a conclusion. And the Declaration, as you're going to see, is a tightly reasoned, tightly argued proposition document. It has 5 major parts, or I call paragraphs. And if you're using the printed versions that I sent out and printed them out, you can see these 5 major. What are they? First of all, there's an introduction, the first paragraph, what we are doing. And you'll see there are 3 verbs in the first paragraph that actually outline what the Americans are doing. They are dissolving the political bands. Go back to Lee's resolution from June 7th, and you'll see the first action the Americans are taking is to sever all political connection to the British. So dissolve the political bands. The second verb is to assume sovereignty. Now we're going to talk about this when we talk about the second paragraph in the Declaration, to assume among the powers of the earth. So, by the way, the first paragraph starts out with, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. The second verb is, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal status to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. And the powers of the earth, I often ask students, what does that mean? What are those referred to? That refers to all the countries of the world. So this second statement is to assume among the other existing nations of the world the separate and equal status as an independent nation. Hold on to that language, as you're going to see. And the third aspect of the Declaration, which tells you something about the basis of its authority and who its intended audience is a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So the Americans are dissolving their political bonds with Britain. They are assuming sovereignty as a separate nation, and they are declaring the causes to whom? To mankind, to the entirety of the human race. Hold on to that idea, because that has something to do with the Declaration's authority and why it claims its teachings are true. The second paragraph, the most famous paragraph of the Declaration, is its core truths, or its theoretical core, the governing ideas of the Declaration. And then you're going to see there are 5 core concepts here, and that's the paragraph that starts, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So what are the 5 major core principles or foundations of the Declaration, its deepest ideas? 1, that human beings are equal. 2, that human beings possess natural rights, that they are free, life, liberty, and self-sovereignty, or as the Declaration's language uses, the pursuit of happiness. The third main idea in this second part is that the purpose of government is to secure rights. The fourth major idea in the outline is that all legitimate government derives its power from the consent of the governed. You can see this in the language of the paragraph. And the last major idea is that whenever government fails to achieve its purpose of securing rights and it becomes tyrannical, and this long next section, the third section, is to prove that the king is a tyrant, as you'll see in a second, that government may be altered or abolished when it becomes destructive of human rights. Now, those are the 5 core theoretical principles of the Declaration, and we'll spend a lot of time in this course in the next week and in the next months exploring the meaning of those ideas. Then, the next longest section of the Declaration, even though, by the way, the Americans started off complaining about Parliament and no representation taxation with no representation, and that it was the several acts of Parliament that started the unpleasant business and the conflict. Nevertheless, it was the king's actions that kind of drew the focused ire as the revolution unfolded. And so the longest section of the Declaration has all these different charges against the king. Now, as you're going to see, there are 5 subsections of this. You can actually organize the charges against the king in 4 major groups. The first 3, and these should be terms to you, are legislative abuses, judicial abuses, and executive abuses, because it's a foreshadowing of the notion of the separation of powers. So it turns out the king has messed up the legislative authority in terms of the colonial legislatures. He's passed bad laws, has refused to give his assent to good laws. He's been a terrible legislator. He's screwed up the legislative function of government. And then starting with the 2 middle statements, that he has obstructed the administration of justice. He's made judges. He's messed up and screwed up and perverted the judicial function of government. And then starting with he has erected a multitude of offices. He's kept us at standing armies, are essentially an abuse of the executive or administrative power of government. But stop! It gets worse. Starting with after several administrative and executive charges, he has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people, transporting large armies and constrained fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas. So, in the first 3, he's perverted or destroyed government through legislative, judicial, and administrative or executive means. Now, he's actually gone beyond government. He's actually waging war. If you were running for office, you probably wouldn't say, elect me and I'll ravage your coast and burn your towns. So this is as bad as it gets. And so the last major section of this part of the Declaration is a conclusion. And what's that conclusion? In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress. That was the First Continental Congress. In terms, most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince, and it would be useful if you had the copy of the Declaration in front of you, by the way, following along with me, and indeed in class for next week too. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So the last major part of this 3rd major section, the charges against the king, is the conclusion is the king is a tyrant. The 4th part begins with, nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. And you'll see there are 2 other guilty parties here. And this isn't trivial. It turns out the Parliament has been a bad actor, as have the British people. Why? Because the Parliament cooperated in the acts of tyranny, and the British people, who should have come to our defense, were indifferent to our loss of blood and to our suffering. And so this isn't just, not only does it expand the 2 other guilty parties, the Parliament and the British people, it also reinforces the notion that this isn't just a controversy or a conflict with the king. It's time for us to cut our relations to the entire British political system and indeed the British people, and to become a new people on our own right. And of course, the last major section of the Declaration is the conclusion. We, therefore, and all good papers and arguments have a conclusion. All good papers and arguments have an introduction and a conclusion, and the conclusion is, and if you tie this back to the language of Lee's resolution on June 7th, you'll see this is the fulfillment of it. And essentially, it reinforces the first action of dissolution or separation. It explains the second concept from the second verb in the introductory paragraph, to assume sovereignty. What does it mean to be a sovereign nation? That we now have the right to be free and independent, as free and independent states, we have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts which independent states may right do. So this little section in the conclusion gives some meaning to what it means to assume sovereignty as a separate and equal nation. And then, of course, the pledge of to each other of our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honors. So, there you have the Declaration, the 5 major parts of the Declaration as an argument and its major subsections. So let's continue and conclude our discussion of this exterior tour of the Declaration with some preliminary issues of language and an interesting question about the basis of authority and whether or not the Declaration is, as you may have heard, is a Christian or even a religious document. Those are not trivial issues, as it turns out. So if you're looking at the notes on page 3, I believe. Yes, page 3 of the notes. I forgot to put page number on the notes. I'll do it differently next time. I quote from Jefferson's rough draft. Remember, the Declaration was drafted by Jefferson during the weeks of June and early July, submitted to the 5-person committee, and then submitted to the Congress. In his original draft, in his rough draft, and you can see, by the way, this is why editing your writing actually improves it. Here's how it read. A declaration of the representatives of the United States of America in General Con's Assembly. And not only you can see this is relatively clumsy language, and it gets better in the revisions in the final version, but there's a critical change of language here that we must pay serious attention to. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for people to advance from that subordination in which they have hitherto remained, and to assume among the powers of the earth the equal and independent station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the change. Here's the critical change in language. The second paragraph originally began, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Jefferson, even before he submitted his final draft to the committee, changed that to, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Now, why is that important? You could say that if it was sacred and undeniable, what makes the statements of the Declaration true is because we believe them. Like we Americans, it's a creedal statement, like the Apostles' Creed, or in Christianity have different creedal statements, which Christians believe and affirm they believe. But why do they believe them? Because they believe them as Christians. Since the Declaration is addressed to all mankind, obviously its truths couldn't be true simply because Americans believe them to be true. They would have to somehow be shown to be true in a way that's what we would call today objectively true, that all human beings could grasp and understand them. And indeed, you're going to see that's the meaning of the shift from the language of from sacred and undeniable to self-evident truth. So then our major question now is to ask, what is the meaning of a self-evident truth? What does it mean to say that a truth is self-evident? Now, to help you here, I included this in the PRQs, the preparation and review questions for this section. I also included a selection from one of the Federalist Papers. Now, the Federalist Papers, we're going to read a lot of them in this course, and we're going to come back to them. Those are the 85 essays written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay under the name of Publius in 1787 to 88 during the ratification struggle over the Constitution. But that's all background. What I want you to pay attention to is Hamilton wrote this essay, we know, from Federalist 31, to the people of the state of New York. Now, I'm going to have to translate some of the language here, but the reason I wanted to lay this language in front of you is this is one of the few contemporaneous. 1787 and 1776 are roughly the same language in the same period, and same Americans speaking. It's an attempt to define and explain what a self-evident truth is. And this becomes critical, as you'll see, as we unpack the Declaration's theoretical teachings. So this is Hamilton writing in Federalist 31. In disquisitions. Disquisition is an old word for essays or arguments or statements, but essay. In disquisitions of every kind, there are certain primary truths or first principles upon which all subsequent reasonings must depend. These contain an internal evidence, antecedent means prior to all reflection or combination. Combination is an older word that we don't use anymore this way, for reflection and thought in the mind. So prior to all reflection or thinking, extended thinking, I should say, and complicated reasoning, that's what combination means, commands the assent of the mind. So in everyday language, there are certain truths which, prior to all complicated reflection, make the mind see what is true. Where it produces not this effect, that is to say, what Hamilton is going to explain in this next section is if a self-evident truth is evident to all human beings, why can't certain human beings see a self-evident truth? It's not as if, by the way, the moment that King George, and evidently he got the Declaration of Independence about 3 weeks after it was written and published, it's not as if he read through it and said, "Oh, yes, I see now. Why, it's so true." Obviously, not everyone's going to see a self-evident truth, and Hamilton in this sentence is going to explain why. And here's his explanation as to why a normally rational human being might not see a self-evident truth. Where it produces not this effect, that is to say, the self-evident truth, it must proceed either from some defect or disorder in the organs of perception, or from the influence of some strong interest, passion, or prejudice. So even though most rational human beings could see the simple truth of a self-evident truth, and we'll see what the term self-evident means in a minute, Hamilton is aware that not everyone can see. Why not? First of all, the mind or the organs of reflection might be so broken that you might not be able to even see a simple truth. Now, by the way, you're going to see for reasons he says in the next sentence, I'm going to use as an example of a self-evident truth, 2 plus 2 equals 4. And if you think about this, how old were you when you began to understand the concept of 2 plus 2 equals 4? You know, the first concept that babies express is no, around the age of 2. That's why parents call this the terrible twos. The second concept that children learn is why, so which is another form of saying no for children. You can't have the keys to the car. Why? Because I said so, and that's how most why questions end. But sooner or later, children begin to actually get a sense of bigger and smaller and more or less. That you got more candy than I did. So you could say this is a presentiment of mathematical thought, and probably around the age of 3 to 4 to 5, most human beings can understand 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute, why it's a statement of math, because Hamilton says this term comes from math and geometry for reasons you'll see. But the other reason you might not be able to see a self is because of some strong interest, passion, or opinion. So yeah, people can be blinded by their self-interest. They can be blinded by a long-standing passion and opinion and not see literally the truth in front of them. And I think probably most of you would agree. There are times when you and other people around you have not been able to see, as they say, beyond the nose on their face because they're blinded, either because some accident has destroyed their brain or perhaps there's a retardation of abilities. I used to work as an intern in the Illinois State Institution for, it was called at that time mentally retarded. And I understand there were even like adults, grown adults, who were so handicapped and diminished in their capacities that they couldn't understand a self-evident truth. Today, most of the members of Congress fall into that category. Just kidding. All right, so, or a passion or an opinion or interest. Of this nature are the maxims in geometry, that the whole is greater than its part. Things equal to the same are equal to one another, etc. So Hamilton is taking this term, and Jefferson derives this term from mathematics. And he continues to discuss. So I kind of summarize this on the 4th page of the notes. So a self-evident truth is a truth that has the certainty of a simple mathematical proposition, such as 2 plus 2 equals 4. So why is this self-evident as opposed to just clear and obvious? Self-evident means its truth is contained within its own terms. Because once you grasp what 2 is, and you take one more of 2, you take the plus and add another 2, even a child's mind understands without almost any thought that the result is 4. So almost every proposition in that easy, simple statement, 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's not 2 plus 2 equals not 4 because we believe it or because it's a long standard tradition. It's embedded, as you'll see, in the very nature of reality as our mathematical truths. At least this was true in the opinion of the founders. Now, by the way, so again, to summarize Hamilton, any human being whose basic grasp of reality has not been obscured by a lack of natural ability to see and think, or a strong prejudice or self-interest or passion and opinion, should be able to grasp it. Now, just for fun, I give you an example of another mathematical or geometrical, algebraic actually, truth, which is not self-evident. It's true, and it's true for the same reasons that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and that is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Most of you will remember from your sufferings in high school algebra that that's the quadratic formula. for resolving quadratic equations of a squared plus b squared plus c squared equals x. Now, it's true, but you understand, this is a level of complexity that it's still true for reasonable rational reasons, and it's not a matter of faith. You can actually work out the quadratic formula, but it's not a self-evident truth in that you can't look at that and say, oh yeah, right, like I knew that when I was 3 years old. 2 plus 2 equals 4, you probably did, as does any rational human being or even child know. It's a self-evident truth because its conclusion is contained within its own internal propositions. It's true that the quadratic formula is also mathematically true and rationally true, not as a matter of faith, although if you got the answer right on your exams in high school, it might have been because you guessed it, and therefore. But its complexity is so great that it loses the self-evident quality. So as you're going to see, the 5 statements in the second part of the Declaration are considered by Jefferson to be self-evident truths. And that means the authors of the Declaration believed its core principles to be objective, that they could be grasped by any human being whose mind wasn't obscured by accident or lack of ability or a strong prejudice or opinion. So, when I asked what's the authority of the Declaration of Independence, the authority of the Declaration is literally the human ability to see and observe the world around them, and to see and think about reality through human reason. Now, that raises the last interesting question that we'll discuss today. Is the Declaration a Christian document? Many people make this statement, or a Jewish or a Muslim document, or a religious document at all. And I'm going to suggest it is not, by the way, although while it is not a Christian document or a Jewish or denominational document, I'm going to argue, as we'll see as the truths unfold, that the statements of the Declaration, although grounded in nature and reason, are compatible with religious faith. But how would one know if it was a Christian document? I suggest 3 ways or measures. 1, does its teaching rest upon the sacred text of that tradition? That is to say, the New Testament. And of course, by that test, you see there is no reference to the language of the New Testament or scriptures in general. Does it mention or rely upon the individual who founds that tradition? Is there any mention of Christ or Jesus or Moses or anyone else? No, as you're going to see, it's nature and nature's God. That leads to the religious question later, as you'll see. Does it embody the core teachings, moral or other, of that tradition? And since we're speaking about Christianity, probably most of you heard of the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemies yourself. Unconditional love is the Christian moral teaching. Now, we will explore the meaning of the teaching of rights, but I will argue that the teaching of rights, that human beings have rights and those rights should be respected, that's not the same thing as Christian love. So I would argue by these 3 measures that the Declaration is not, in fact, a Christian document. It doesn't rely on the sacred text of the Christian tradition. It doesn't rely on the authority of Jesus or Christ, nor does it embody the moral teachings of Christianity, although we can discuss this in class. And the last major question, since it does refer to nature and nature's God, and God is, and I'm not going to answer all the PRQs that I lay in front of you, but here I'll specifically address them. It turns out there are, in fact, 4 references to God. God is mentioned 4 times. The laws of nature and nature's God. They are endowed by their creator, appealing to the supreme judge of the world, and with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. Here's my take on that. The most likely possibility is that the Declaration does not rely upon religion or religious principles, but is open to them or compatible with them, because most of the founders of the Declaration, drafters of the Declaration, most Americans then and now, are religious people. And therefore, when we say a God-given right, we understand that rights are created both by nature and perhaps ratified by God, but we'll explore that next week. So what is the basis of authority, and why is this important? To whom is it addressed? It is addressed to mankind, and therefore its self-evident truths from mathematics, common sense reason, should be available and graspable by all human beings. So, as you're going to see, the authority of nature and reason, because what is it that reason knows and sees so that it sees the truth of these things? Nature, human nature, and you'll see that's where we'll begin on Monday. So that closes our initial introduction to the Declaration, and we will see you on Monday to pick up the first of its three core theoretical teachings, the doctrine of nature. What is nature?